So this marks the end of the readings of the Psalms and marks the beginning of moving into the Platonic dialogues. Now exactly how many I will do, I'm not too sure yet. I have all of them sitting in front of me here. I may do a few and then go back to the Old Testament or American history or something like this, but we'll see how it goes. This is my second attempt at recording this episode. The first time, my approach was to sort of do the same thing that I was doing with the Psalms, sort of read the poem or the song, and then to talk about it. But the dialogues are a little bit too long, I think, to do the same sort of thing. Of course, I could read them and give my commentary on them. However, I'm not sure that that is the best use of time. So rather, I think my approach is going to be to read only select passages that are relevant, that are necessary to understanding the dialogue, sort of the fundamental elements of it. And the rest, the sort of narrative arc, I will do my best to explain, sort of freestyle, free-handed. So what does Plato have for us? Well, this is titled Euthyphro. It's a dialogue between Socrates and Euthyphro. And so the setting is in front of a court, King Archon's court. And we learn that Socrates is there because somebody has indicted him for corrupting the city youth. We also learn that Euthyphro is there because he is indicting his father for murder. Now, the interesting thing about Socrates is that the man that indicts him goes by the name of Meletus. This Meletus is from a political region that I believe neighbors Socrates. And I think it's possible that they have similar ideas of justice, let's say. And I think this makes it particularly interesting. It's interesting because of their disagreement. And what's more is that Socrates, instead of being upset, angry, he's glad that Meletus is looking out for the young, and that he wants the good for the young. No doubt he disagrees with Meletus's charge, and yet he still finds the good in Meletus's action, which I think is a fundamental thing. And this is right at the outset of this dialogue. Now, more on this indictment of Socrates. The interesting thing is when Socrates says, in response to what Meletus says that Socrates does to corrupt the young, Socrates replies, "Strange things to hear him tell it, for he says that I am a maker of gods, and on the ground that I create new gods, while not believing in the old gods. He has indicted me for their sake," as he puts it. So of creating new gods and not believing in old gods. This is a paradigm shift. If this is to be true, it's a fundamentally different way of thinking, a different way of seeing. And this different way of seeing, I think, threatens the old way. If you threaten the old way, the established way, this upends one's perception. And to upend one's perception, I think, confuses one's identity. It confuses the soul. Or in other words, it confuses the seat of being of the individual. An inherently destabilizing thing. Now Euthyphro makes an interesting statement in response to Socrates. He says that he makes this comparison, and he includes Socrates in on it. He says something to the effect of, you and I, Socrates and I, are the ones that are after this divine insight. And we are the ones that foretell, or we are the ones that explain. And there are those that do not listen to us. They laugh us, they mock us, because they do not understand. They don't understand our kind, the type of people who are interested. So what interests me here is primarily in Euthyphro's categorization, this separation in kind. Socrates replies and he says that it doesn't matter that they laugh at you, because the Athenians, in his words, do not mind anyone they think clever, as long as he does not teach in his own wisdom. But if they think that he makes others to be like himself, they get angry, whether through envy, as you say, or for some other reason. Now it becomes interesting when Euthyphro explains exactly what happened with his father and why he's prosecuting him for murder. Socrates says, in response to Euthyphro's revelation that he's there to prosecute his own father, he says, good heavens, certainly, Euthyphro, most men would not know how they could do this and be right. It's not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom. And he says this because the one that is far in advance of wisdom, the one that would prosecute their own father in pursuit of the truth, must have some elevated understanding of justice. And that's to assume that Euthyphro has good intentions, that he is actually after justice and the good, and not just to put his father in prison for his own gain. So Euthyphro says in response to Socrates that he should not be ridiculous. It doesn't matter what the relation is from one person to another. If they commit a crime, if they pervert justice, then they should be brought to justice. And the interesting thing is, he continues by saying that one of his servants, this is Euthyphro, one of his servants, killed another person in some drunken dispute. And so Euthyphro's father bound his hands and his feet, this servant, and placed him in a pit. And he went to see a seer, or sort of a wise person, perhaps a priest of sorts. And when they came back, the man that was thrown into the pit with his hands and feet bound had died because of cold and hunger. And so there are relatives of Euthyphro's family that say, they're angry. They say, well, why would you prosecute him? He didn't even kill him. And even if he had killed him, then is this not justified because the person that Euthyphro's father killed was in fact a murderer? And Euthyphro's response to this is that the people that accuse him of this, his relatives that feel this way, have a poor understanding of justice. His relatives say that it is impious for a son to prosecute his father for murder, but their ideas of the divine attitude to piety and impiety are wrong. And so here is where the conversation really begins, because Socrates says, "Whereas by Zeus, Euthyphro, you think that your knowledge of the divine and of piety and impiety is so accurate that, when those things happen as you say, you have no fear of having acted impiously in bringing your father to trial." And the funny thing is, the response by Socrates is typical Socrates. It is to see the good. It's almost seeing into a state of condescension. And I don't believe that he means to do so, but he has such a faith in his way that it becomes humorous, I think, at times. And by that I mean, he says, he gives Euthyphro the benefit of the doubt, and he says, well, if he makes this claim, if he truly believes that, or if he truly knows that what the pious, the nature of the pious is and what the impious is, he knows that he is right to prosecute his father. He knows that he is not being impious to do so, as his relatives accuse him of. Then I must have something to learn from this person. At the very least, I should be able to understand where he's coming from. The principle by which he seats himself upon the sort of pillar of stability and of security. And so he says, I'll become your pupil. And as you teach me this knowledge, I will use this knowledge against Meletus in court. And if it comes to pass that this doesn't work, then it should be, and if this indictment is not discharged against me, then the indictment should be brought against you as well. And Euthyphro says, yes, by Zeus, Socrates. And if he should try to indict me, I think I would find his weak spots, and the talk in the court would be about him rather than about me. So again we see this steadfastness of faith in Euthyphro's ideas of the pious and the impious. The question is it right, what he believes? And so Socrates says, all right, Euthyphro, tell me. Not necessarily in the condescending way. It probably sounded like that, how I said it, but in the text here it doesn't seem to be that way. It's a matter of fact. It's, so tell me now, by Zeus, what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and godliness are? Godliness and ungodliness. Sort of sounded like I said godliness twice there. Both as regards to murder and other things. Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious, and the like itself? And everything that is to be impious presents us with one form or appearance insofar as it is impious. And so we see here Socrates' desire to find the principle of piety, and impiousness, the form that they take. and not the idea of piety or of piousness to be sort of split and fractured based on the context. And so to this Euthyphro agrees. And Socrates says, "Tell me then, what is the pious, and what the impious do you say?" And a very interesting response by Euthyphro, because what he says in response to what is pious and what is impious is that what is pious is to prosecute the wrongdoer, is to maintain this state of justice, whether it be a murderer or a temple robber, even if it is your father. And not to prosecute is impious. And then he goes into an example of the city gods. He gives the example of Zeus. Zeus being a highly revered god. And yet, Zeus bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons, and that he in turn castrated his father for similar reasons. And he says, but they, people in the town or his relatives, are angry with me because I am prosecuting my father for his wrongdoing. They contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. And then Socrates says, indeed, Euthyphro, this is the reason why I'm a defendant in the case, because I find it hard to accept things like that being said about the gods, and it is likely to be the reason why I shall be told I do wrong. Their opinions, then, we must agree with them. 2, it would seem, for what are we to say, we who agree that we ourselves have no knowledge of them? Tell me, by the God of friendship, do you really believe these things are true? So Socrates comes back at Euthyphro, and he challenges him. He says, you have not told me in any detail what the pious is. You have just told me that what you are doing now in prosecuting your father for murder is pious. And he says, well, there are many different pious actions. And so the appeal here is to something deeper than the action in front of us. We are after a principle, a greater depth of understanding. And here is one of the key statements in this dialogue. Bear in mind, then, that I did not bid you to tell me one or two of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. For you agreed that all impious actions are impious, and all pious actions are pious through one form. Or don't you remember? And then Euthyphro says, I do. So again, we're after this unity, this deep underlying principle. And so Euthyphro says, of the pious, what is dear to the gods is pious. What is not is impious. And this proceeds to open a can of worms, because the Socratic way is to follow the various branches, the branches that are grown from a seed, a principle that is planted. And so what principle have we here? We have the gods and their preferences, what they love what is dear to them is considered pious, is considered morally upright. It is considered good. What is disdained by the gods, or unloved, not loved, is impious. And so why would this be? What positions do the gods hold that gives them the authority to determine what is pious and what is impious? What can we say of their conduct? Now, if it is indeed the case that there is something about their conduct which would potentially pollute the virtuosity or the good within the pious, and I would even say the good that defines the impious, then we are in a bit of a predicament. Because now we have the gods that are formed by a culture that do not shape up, that do not satisfy the language. They do not satisfy the very thing by which we convey meaning. It is not the only thing, of course, but it is one very important, very crucial element in human interaction, our language. And so Socrates proceeds, and he says, is it not true that the gods have their differences? That the gods are in a state of discord? That they are at odds with each other? That they are at enmity with each other? And Euthyphro agrees to this. And Socrates proceeds to say, well, what are the things that can cause us to be at odds with one another? He says, if we consider a disagreement about a matter of counting, about which is greater and which is less, he asks if this difference would make us enemies and angry with each other. And then he says, or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our differences about this? Euthyphro says, we would certainly count to resolve this difference. It's reasonable to do so. The answer is there for us to see clearly. Socrates continues with a few other examples that involve measure. They involve some standard. But the thing that Socrates does not do is that he does not explore, at least immediately, what it is about the first example that leads two men to come to an agreement. It seems to us an obvious thing, but it only seems to us obvious if we are both after the truth. And so let's say, for the sake of argument, that we are after the truth, and this matter of determining a number of that is greater and that of which is lesser is not much of an issue for us, assuming that we can reasonably establish which is which. But therein lies the problem. What is reasonable? Why is it that the numerical value provides us with a definitive argument, or a definitive standard, I should say, someplace by which we can draw the line In a like manner, Socrates gives further examples. He says again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measure and soon cease to differ. And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled. We would be reconciled because there is what we would call in this day an objective standard, something that is readily perceivable, that is outside of the human being, something that is constant, that follows certain laws. The laws themselves often are not directly perceivable by us, though they can be known, they can be observed. But this matter of reason that I take for granted is not altogether straightforward when I consider why it would make sense to me if we have two substances, if one is larger and one is smaller. Why would I instinctively intuit that one is greater than the other? Of course, I would have to have some conception of language, but even if I had no conception of language, I would still be able to categorize these objects. I would be able to understand that one is different than the other. I would infer, likely based on my experience, that the larger one is heavier, and the smaller one is lighter. Now, of course, this is not always the case, but assuming it's the same substance, its density is the same. The numerical example is probably the best, because it doesn't require much context. It's straight and to the point. To the point is to the principle. And the principle, I think, in matters of known standards, it's easy to see. It's easy to understand, to make a connection to form a bridge between a question and an answer. But for loftier matters, forming that bridge is much harder. Much, much harder. And Socrates says, what subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? He says, examine as I tell you whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we are unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do? Now, why would it be the case? Why can't we make a decision similar to that of the numerical value of which is greater and which is lesser? Why can we not commit this to measure? Just like we did when we determined which is larger and which is smaller. And about the heavier and the lighter. Now, I may have misspoke earlier, conflated two examples. I gave the example that Socrates had given of the larger and the smaller, and then gave another example about the heavier and the lighter in the same mode of thought. But if we separate these out, I think my point still stands. The larger and the smaller still is bound by some standard. Now, we could still say something of the larger and the smaller that could deceive our perception. We often see these examples on maybe on an IQ test or sort of in a physics textbook. these sorts of questions that are asked, proposed, on purpose because they are deceiving at their surface. And it's important for us to understand how to come to the right conclusion despite that deception. Now, having said that, and returning to the loftier subjects of what is just and unjust, beautiful and ugly, good and bad, is it the case that we cannot come to an agreement because of these? We cannot come to an agreement because there is no standard. There's no law that's readily available for us to intuit of what is good and what is bad, what is beautiful and what is ugly. There are too many variables for us to put together. Now, I think it's a matter of faith for one to believe that there is some standard of what is just and unjust, of what is beautiful and unbeautiful. It may be imperfect, and we may at times find ourselves deceived by the very similar types of deception that can evade our perception in the natural world. Let's say of the heavier and of the lighter. But of course, we commit these to measure, and regardless of how they appear to us, we have that standard. But how do we place justice on a scale? How do we bring it down to our material existence? It seemingly floats above us at all times. Of course, actions have their consequences. But do these consequences only occur under certain circumstances? Are the circumstances themselves malleable, pliable? There's just something within our reality that can truly tell us what the weight is on the scales of justice. Is there something that we can truly identify that is beautiful and truly identify as ugly? And so Socrates says, what about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they have differences, will it not be about these same subjects? And he agrees that the gods must and do argue over these subjects. And if we imagine ourselves in the scenario in which one god says that one thing is pious, and another god indicates that another thing is pious, and the two happen to be opposites, then we find ourselves in a predicament if we follow Euthyphro's reasoning. Because now we have a situation in which what is loved by the gods is pious, but now we have the situation in which the pious and the impious are the same thing. And if you have two things that are at once opposites and yet the same thing, they cannot have an opposite, because itself is a combination of an agonism and an antagonism. Now there's no force, I think, that binds these things together. So we wouldn't see these sorts of things, I don't think, in the heavenly realm. Now, when I say we wouldn't see these in the heavenly realm, I don't mean that they cannot exist artificially. But in terms of the unity of it all, in terms of the agreement by some standard, just like the standard of measure, whether it be weight or size or otherwise, this agonism-antagonism unity does not hold. It doesn't mean that it cannot exist, because there are many situations, there are many uses of language, many uses of rhetoric, of arguing for one's belief, that may not really lie on principle, but rather on the desire to win, the desire to defeat an opponent. So anyway, we are now stuck with this dilemma in Euthyphro's reasoning. And so Socrates says, the same things then are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God loved and God hated. This is what we just described. He says, and the same things would be both pious and impious, according to this argument. Again, what we've already stated. Now, Euthyphro agrees with this reasoning, and Socrates continues. So Socrates scolds him a bit, and he says, so you did not answer my question, you surprising man. He goes on to say, I didn't ask you about what same thing is both pious and impious. And he brings up the example, the situation that Euthyphro finds himself in, of prosecuting his father for murder, and indicating, well, some gods may think that this is a pious action, while others do not, just as is the case that Euthyphro himself believes that it is a pious action, is what he's arguing for after all. And he's placing his father's freedom, his father's sovereignty on the line for it, for this belief. And yet, there are members in his family that see things just the opposite. And so it would seem to be an important thing for us to discover the truth of this matter. Where is the standard? Can we narrow down the pious and the impious, rather than, or I should say, in a more sophisticated way than what we are given initially with Euthyphro's reasoning, that what is pious is loved by the gods? Because now we know again that what is loved by the gods can be two different things. They can be opposites. Then the argument is, well, perhaps that this is just one of those things that, even though, despite the disagreements by the gods, piety and impiety are two subjects that the gods just always fundamentally agree on. And then Socrates sort of says in response, he says, well, now, Euthyphro, have you ever heard any man maintaining that one who has killed or done anything else unjustly should not pay the penalty? And Euthyphro replies by saying that they're always arguing this subject, both elsewhere and in the courts. For when they have committed many wrongs, they do and say anything to avoid the penalty. And Socrates says, do they agree that they have done wrong? And in spite of so agreeing, do they nevertheless say that they should not be punished? And Euthyphro says, no, They do not agree on that point. And I think this is fundamental. Because it would seem, in this case, that what is just and what is unjust does not appear to man, in some cases, to be universal. That is, a man can commit a crime, they could break the law, and in so doing, they can believe that their behavior was completely just, whether it be something as lofty as murder or otherwise. Now, this is not to say that the law that this person broke was just, but as a matter of mere reflection on the individual level. What is it about man that allows him to deviate so markedly from another's mind and perception of reality, that what is so fundamental as to be considered good and evil, or just and unjust, differs between them? So they do not say or do just anything, for they do not venture to say this, or dispute that they must not pay the penalty if they have done wrong. But I think they deny doing wrong. Is that not so? And Euthyphro says, that is true. Then they do not dispute that the wrongdoer must be punished, but they may disagree as to who the wrongdoer is, what he did, and when. And so here we have a different idea. Now it has not come to any conclusion. We don't know Socrates' beliefs on the matter, just from this. But at least one possibility, one potential conclusion, could be that who is right and who is wrong is relative, and that it's all based on a matter of perspective. But if everything was based on our perspective, would we not live in a world of continual tension, this tension that its primary mode of being is disintegration, atomization, rather than union and solidarity, something of structure, of stability? So we've come to a bit of an informal agreement between Socrates and Euthyphro that, regardless of one's perspective, most people agree that the wrongdoer must be punished. So again, the question remains, if the wrongdoer must be punished, then who decides, and what is the standard for wrong and right? Of course, this begs the question of their broader argument about the pious and the impious. So at this point in the conversation, they have come to an understanding. They've come to a certain distance in their conversation. Perhaps it's not considered to be an understanding. There's no conclusiveness to it. But where we are is that what all of the gods collectively agree on, what they collectively love, is considered to be the pious. And what they collectively do not love, or collectively hate, we could say, is impious. And we also acknowledge the fact that there are gods that have disagreements among one another. And so the gods that do not agree on certain aspects, certain things, may be neither pious or impious, or both pious and impious. this sort of paradoxical predicament that we have yet to solve. And so Euthyphro says, what prevents us from holding this view? And Socrates says, for my part, nothing. But look whether on your part this proposal will enable you to teach me most easily what you promised. So we're back from square one. And there's something about perspective that seems to influence our opinions. Now, how exactly that might lead one to the truth is uncertain. But again, arguing from the premise that what all the gods love is pious and what they hate is impious. The question now is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? And so here we have a matter of being and of form. Piousness as a thing in and of itself, rather than a creation of the gods. It's an interesting conception, because in this model, the gods are not supreme, the principle is supreme. And what unites the gods is the principle. On the other hand, is what is to be considered pious the result of the love that the gods show for a particular action? So in other words, is it a creation of the gods, or is it independent of them, above them, in a fundamental sense? And so Euthyphro doesn't quite understand what Socrates means by this. And so Socrates continues and he says, I shall try to explain more clearly. We speak of something carried and something carrying, of something led and something leading, of something seen and something seeing. And you understand that these things are all different from one another and how they differ. And Euthyphro agrees. And so he says, so there is something loved and a different thing, something loving. Euthyphro agrees. And then Socrates says, tell me then, whether the thing carried is a carried thing because it is being carried, or for some other reason. And Euthyphro says, no, that is the reason. That is, the thing carried is a carried thing because it is being carried. Now I'd like to break this down a little bit. And so to my mind, to my initial impression, when I think of something carried and something carrying, I think of two different objects. That is to say, when I consider something carried, I think of the thing, the object that is carried. And when I think of something carrying, I think of the thing that is doing the action of the carrying. And so here we have an action being done, and sort of an action that is being received. Something is having something done to it. Now, for this thing to be carried, it must be carried by something. This action must be within the world, within this reality. It must be happening in order for the carried thing to indeed be carried. Socrates says it is not being seen because it is a thing seen, but on the contrary, it is a thing seen because it is being seen, nor is it something led that it is being led, but because it is being led that it is something led. Nor is something being carried because it is something carried, but it is something carried because it is being carried. And then he asks, is what I want to say clear, Euthyphro? I want to say this, namely, that if anything is being changed, or is being affected in any way, it is not being changed because it is something changed, but rather it is something changed because it is being changed, nor is it being affected because it is something affected, but it is something affected because it is being affected. Or do you not agree? And I think if we can say anything, we can at least say that there is something of a relationship here. That the action, regardless of the party, I think is afforded a connection. And sticking with one example so we don't get lost in the various weeds of different examples, we'll stick with the example of the carried. Socrates says, nor is something being carried because it is something carried, but it is something carried because it is being carried. Nor is it something being carried because it is something carried. What can we say to break this down? We can say that something being carried. So of the statement, nor is something being carried because it is something carried, we can say that there is not only in the correction of the terms that Socrates gives, the action and relationship, but there is also a matter of context, because being is something quite fundamental. Now something, any object that sits in front of me, this bottle of multivitamins that sits in front of me, it is a thing that sits on the table. It is not a thing because it sits on the table, but it is a thing that sits on the table because it is sitting on the table. And so this may not seem like a fundamental distinction. And why Socrates brings this up, I think, is central to their argument. Because if we are to reduce a thing or something's being beneath that which is being done to it, or the condition that it finds itself in the world, then its being is inherently submitted to a condition. It is being submitted to, I don't want to say something false. Certainly, it is a twist in logic. A sort of a false logic. To say that the thing that sits on this table is a thing because it sits on the table. What it does, what it is doing, and what is being done to it is being done to it because something is being done to it. But it does not, the action that is being done to it does not invade its nature. It does not invade its fundament. The bottle of pills has a more fundamental unifying being than its interaction with this environment. And so he says, I want to say this, namely, that if anything is being changed, or is being affected in any way, it is not being changed because it is something changed, but rather it is something changed because it is being changed. Now this is a more difficult example than a stationary, static object. If something is being changed or is being affected in any way, it is not being changed because it is something changed, but it is something changed because it is being changed. We could say that something is changed to represent the situation or the event that unfolded as this sort of recognition, the boundary between one condition and another. But these are two separate conditions. Now the thing changed is something in and of itself. It is a changed thing. But in order to get from point A to point B, there had to be this crossing point that crosses over between the boundary. And I think that this crossing point is in some way fundamental to this argument. We've already discussed, and at the expense of the laboriousness and frustrating way of this episode, we've already mentioned the example relating to the thing being carried as sort of a relationship. That is, the thing that is doing the carrying and the thing being carried, there is a relationship that unites them. And I think this is fundamental to our point. Because if the gods love the pious, there has to be some... Let me go further before I make that claim. If the gods are to love the pious, let's assume that statement is true. Let's also assume the statement that the gods are often at odds with each other, and they often disagree with things. Let's also assume that there is something out there that is pious in a pure form. And so this piousness out there, just like this bottle of pills, they're multivitamins, it has a distinct body to it, a distinct form. Now we can disagree all day long, just as I rattled the pills in front of this microphone. We can argue all day long if we just listen to the audio, and if we just hear the rattling of the pills, if it is actually a bottle of multivitamins. For you only have my word. Could we not convince ourselves that this is a bottle of narcotics? This is a bottle of fentanyl pills? This is a bottle of psychiatric medication? We don't exactly know. In this way, we have limited perception. And I think our limited perception can often get us into trouble. It can make us say things that are overly confident, make false claims. And I think it can also, perhaps, afford us with a certain type of knowledge given our relationship to the object. So, just like the heart as something that is the seat of our desires and our feelings, it can go astray. I think our feelings and our desires are sort of similar to our perception. Our feelings and our desires are sort of a consequence, in some regard, of our perception. We can have feelings from many different inputs. Perhaps it's not just limited to perception. But I say this to say, I mentioned the nature of the heart, to say that if we are operating within a space of uncertainty, and we have this object, this sort of gas pedal of life that is the heart, if all we have is a rock to place over the gas pedal, surely the car will crash. And it's not until we input a conscious, directed driver that understands where he wants to go and why he wants to go there, that we then have this direction of the heart, the direction of the desires and the feelings. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that where he is going is right or where he wants to go. This is a problem in and of itself. There are layers to this sort of thing. The layer of the unconscious driver, the layer of the conscious driver, the layer of the conscious driver driving to the optimal place that he should be going to, taking the optimal route, optimal path. And I think in regard to these levels, in regard to the relationship between the boundary between two things, between the thing carried and the thing that is doing the carrying, there is a relationship. There is a relationship that connects what is being changed and something that is changed. And that relationship should not be mistaken for the thing that is changed, or the thing that is precipitating the change to take place. It is this relationship, a dynamic, unfolding thing. It's a process. It is a cascade of events. And so to round out this thought, to return it back to the gods as I have done already, but to retrace this path, to bring it back home to what Socrates and Euthyphro are talking about. What is pious? Maybe something. Now there are a few different directions I can go here. Now on the nature of gods, on the nature of the Greek metaphysic at the time, perhaps is limited by their divergent nature. The very fact that their gods are multiplicitous, and the forms that they are exploring are unitary, that it's difficult for them to conceive of exactly what the form of this good is. Now Socrates, I think, is on his way to unfold this problem. I think it's part of the very reason why he's on trial for corrupting the city youth, not believing in the city gods. I think this is part of the reason why in Apology he's put to death. I think this is part of the reason why we have the narrative set up the way it is, between a man that is indicting his father for murder under strange circumstances. It's not just pure, outright murder for the sake of wanting to kill another human being. It's circumstantial. It's almost ambiguous. And again, Socrates' circumstance. What does it mean to corrupt the city youth? Why is this such a heinous offense? I think it's because the blooming of a flower is dangerous. And understanding how to bloom a flower and to bloom it on command, I think is even more dangerous. It's not dangerous for the individual. It's not dangerous for the individual soul. It's quite the opposite. It's beneficial. But it threatens the stability of a society. The blooming of a flower may capture the heart of people. And as we've discussed, the heart can be a potentially deceiving thing if it is not properly directed. The soul needs to be involved. The soul is the seat of being, and the seat of being needs to be connected to the highest form of being. Now, if you have a blooming of a flower that is somewhere of a point lesser than that of discussing the complete unity of all being, and if we live in a society that has a metaphysic that is multiplicitous, and the blooming of a flower in the circumstance would lead to a new way of seeing and of viewing, it creates a period of instability. And so it's no wonder why Socrates would be put to death. It's no wonder why he would be indicted for corrupting the city youth, not believing in the city gods, trying to create his own gods. But let us continue. So now we have another step in this staircase to hopefully some sort of enlightenment. The pious is a thing in and of itself. It has its own form, its own character, and it is loved by the gods, which means these are two separate things, in a sense. That meaning that the love of the gods, or the God loved, is different from that which is pious. And piousness is sort of a principle. And that which is loved, or that is doing the loving by the gods, is coming from outside of that object. And so one differs from the other. Now we might ask the question, well, you say that one differs from the other, but before you said there has to be this relationship between the boundary of one thing and the other. And now I'd say yes. This boundary is indeed there, but the relationship is sort of formed by the will of the gods. They illuminate this principle. The mind brings down the principle from its high place so that we can see it, so that we can appreciate it, so that we can live it, so that we have the capacity to transform ourselves within it or from it, however you want to see it. Now we've come to an interesting point, a pivotal point, I think, in the dialogue. We have a rather confusing set of sentences that are strewn together by Socrates. He's talking about the nature of the God loved. We start from a premise and we move forward. He says, "But if the God loved and the pious were the same, my dear Euthyphro, then if the pious was being loved because it was pious, the God loved would also be being loved because it was God loved. And if the God loved was God loved because it was being loved by the gods, then the pious would also be pious because it was being loved by the gods. But now you see that they are in opposite cases as being altogether different from each other. The one is such as to be loved because it is being loved. The other is being loved because it is such as to be loved. I'm afraid, Euthyphro, that when you were asked what piety is, you did not wish to make its nature clear to me, but you told me an affect or quality of it. that the pious has the quality of being loved by all the gods. But you have not yet told me what the pious is. Now if you will, do not hide things from me, but tell me again from the beginning what piety is, whether being loved by the gods or having some other quality. We shall not quarrel about that, but be keen to tell me what the pious and the impious are. And so first things first, I think it's going to take some time to break this down. First and foremost, I think we can appreciate how confusing those sentences are. Secondly, I think we can appeal to a thought that we had earlier about the nature of polytheism. I think there is something inherent within its multiplicity, within the elevated beings, the highest beings of that sort of influence man are separate from one another. I think we run into all sorts of problems. And I think we also have a problem of rationality here. Our reason comes up against a paradox. Now, I think there are a few different problems with this paradox. One of them is made complicated by the very thing that I just mentioned, about the multiplicity of gods, about them having differing opinions, about them being elevated beings and yet separate from one another. And we have this idea about the form of piousness and its relationship to these multiplicitous beings. Now, of course, we are working through a hypothetical here. We're starting with the statement, but if the God loved and the pious were the same, then we could get into this sort of predicament. Now, it is possible to view the piousness separate from the polytheistic gods, and in that circumstance, in that context, I think it's correct. But in the broader context, in the context perhaps of reality, a more unifying picture of reality, what is pious is from one central source. Now, I introduced some of this thought, I think, earlier when I was talking about the way that the gods act by their love. So if they give love to something, it increases its intelligibility. It increases the light that's shown on something. Now, we can shine a light on almost anything. We can shine a light on almost anything in the darkness. But it doesn't mean that what we shine the light on is going to be significant or meaningful to us. There, in the first case, has to be a certain set of circumstances. There has to be context that allows the object that is intelligible to us to be salient. That's number one. I think number two, assuming that we are beings of reasonable experience, we have thought about things, we've gone through things, we've seen different things, we have built different images in our mind. Our mind is more of a sophisticated thing rather than this sort of rudimentary adolescent thing. Then I think if we shine a light on something, we may, by virtue of our capacity and also experience, we may find something more meaningful. And now I think in the cases when we find something more meaningful, then it is immediately useful to us. And I think in this context, especially in the ancient Greek context and the polytheistic context, the multiplicity of gods are sort of this multiplicity of different flashlights, sort of the street lights in an otherwise dark environment that illuminates certain things. Now, whether us humans pick up on it or not is another matter. But let's say we do pick up on something, and it is something that's meaningful to us. What does it mean that this light has allowed us to see this meaningful object? is it because of the light that allowed us to see it? Is it the individual light that allowed us to see it? In a sense, yes. But it would be a mistake to say that just because the light allowed us to see something, that it is then because of that light that we can see the object in a way that is meaningful to us. And so this is sort of a problem with our language. I could use see in two different senses. I could use see in sort of the base sense of the natural sense, in which there is incoming information from the external environment that is outside of my body, let's say. And then there's a type of seeing that's involved with mind or of meaning, sort of the more the heavenly, divine type seeing. And so I think that it's very difficult to see in the mind sense when we are continually distracted. When we have this multiplicity of different views and perspectives. Now, it doesn't mean that the perspective is wrong. It just means that the perspective needs to be taken in consideration with a broader context. And I know this is vague, but it is the beginning of some much broader thought. And I think it ultimately ends with a Unitarian philosophy of things that converge. So that the pious, or the elevated things, are ultimately part of the source of all things that are good and elevated. The fact that we can outline a category such as piousness or piety, I think is a category of mind. It could be a divine category. But if we try to say that piousness is the God loved, and perhaps by extension we could say, well, what are the gods if not God loved? So this is the problem. They would have to be loved by something else, I would think. To give the gods themselves intelligibility, there has to be a source of intelligibility. Now eventually we'll reach this paradox even of the unity. And that's where our reason breaks down, our very capacity to appreciate and to see the divine breaks down. Because there's more involved than just pure reason. And so to sort of wrap up this thought and to continue with the dialogue, I will say that there's something within the nature of the infinite that is inherently antagonistic to our reason. Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but I think this dialogue is helping me explore these thoughts a little bit better. So let's continue. Now, Euthyphro makes a good point. He says, "But Socrates, I have no way of telling you what I have in mind, for whatever proposition we put forth goes around and refuses to stay put where we established it." So now what Socrates puts forth is this proposition to see whether Euthyphro thinks that all that is pious is of necessity just. And Euthyphro says, I think so. Now Socrates says, and is then all that is just pious? Or is all that is pious just? But not all that is just pious, but some of it is, and some is not. And to this Euthyphro says, I don't follow what you're saying, Socrates. So this is another opportunity for the unfolding of a flower. It's not much of a statement, but it is something to ponder. It's an affordance. Again, the affordance of the unfolding. The affordance of the relationship. And so I think it's our responsibility to accept this and to explore it. So he says, and is then all that is just pious? Or is all that is pious just? But not all that is just pious, but some of it is and some of it is not. So this is sort of a continuation of what we were talking about with the gods. And perhaps it's just some of the gods that love piety. Perhaps there are circumstances to piety. There's situations in which there's like a scale of piety, a piety meter. And so Socrates says in response to Euthyphro, he mentions that he's saying the opposite of what a poet of his day said. Quoting him, he says, "You do not wish to name Zeus, who had done it, and who made all things grow. For where there is fear, there is also shame." Now, from what I get from this is he's saying that the man that had done the thinking to see the form of Zeus, I guess we could say, and gave Zeus his contours, gave Zeus a name, thereby identifying the thing that made all things grow. And then he says, for where there is fear, there is also shame. Now what could this mean? The person that identifies this being, this transcendent being, the being that is above man. And now in this mind, there are many different beings that are above man, but at the very least, this being is a central figure, central and certainly above man. Coming to the realization that the being that is above man made all things grow. And then in response to this declaration that you do not wish to name Zeus, the reason is for where there is fear, there is also shame. An interesting statement. I think about the Christian God when I think of fear. Often the Old Testament is full of language of fearing God, and on the surface it sounds negative. But we fear that which can truly judge us, because we should be afraid of our ignorance. Because I think it's often, not always, but often within our ignorance that we make mistakes. And regardless of our intention, we can suffer the consequences of these mistakes. And I think there is a sense of shame that can come from this. But Socrates goes on to say that he doesn't agree with this. He's saying the opposite. He says, I do not think that where there is fear, there is also shame. For I think that many people who fear disease and poverty and many other such things feel fear, but are not ashamed of things they fear. Do you not think so? And Euthyphro says, I do indeed. And so what can we say of this statement in relation to the poem, for which Socrates says he believes the opposite? Now, in some sense, we have a degradation, a misplace of context, perhaps. I do not think that where there is fear, there is also shame. Now, it's interesting, this shame. Shame is a word that means embarrassed or guilty because of one's actions. Now, the funny thing about language is the multifaceted way of our words. Because in the sense of the poem, I think it means shame that follows fear, but this fear is in the sense of fearing the divine, in the sense of judgment. But here, Socrates gives an example of people who fear disease and poverty, who feel fear, but are not ashamed of the things that they fear. And he says, but where there is shame, there is also fear. For is there anyone who, in feeling shame and embarrassment at anything, does not also at the same time fear and dread a reputation for wickedness? Now, this is an interesting conception. In order to properly understand this conception, I think we need to go back to when Socrates is talking about the fact that he does not believe in the essence of this poem. He says, for I think that many people who fear disease and poverty and many other such things feel fear, but are not ashamed of the things they fear. Now, this matter of guilt, I think, or shame, I guess we can call it, but by extension, by equivalence, we can say guilt. I don't think it is at every time, at every instance, a certainty in the mind of man. Rather, I should put this differently. It is a certainty in the mind of man, but it doesn't mean it is right in the mind of man. And I think this is the fundamental distinction here. His feelings and his guilt are the only things that we are seemingly operating with here. But if one's feelings are going to be the only thing that determines one's guilt, that's hardly a way of determining what is just and what is unjust, or to determine the pious nature, or to, going back to the original argument, and is then all that is just pious, or is all that is pious just? But not all that is pious. But not all that is just pious. But some of it is and some of it is not. It must begin with what is right, the truth of what is right, and just this piousness, this devotion, must be the the way that one lives their life towards justice, towards the right, towards the good, towards the full conception, the full idea of justice. The problem is how to get there. And Plato's argument, saying that there are people who fear disease and poverty, but are not ashamed of these things, of the things they fear. To fear disease and to fear poverty is to fear judgment, because one that is to find themselves in a state of poverty, in a state of disease, may have been able to prevent it somewhere up the chain. Certainly in the modern context, this is the case. Now there is a glaring, unfortunate reality about our nature and about the world that we find ourselves in, that disease and even poverty seemingly are indifferent to many of our actions. But again, herein lies the problem of indifference, of the not caring. Now, before, when I mentioned indifference, I mentioned in the sense of this divine indifference. But it's not indifference because of a lack of caring. It's an indifference because of the standard of what is just. But if we are to take this characterization, this indifference due to the standard of what is just, as being the sort of divine law that decides what is right and what is wrong, what can we say of natural phenomena that seems to not follow this law? That judgment, such as disease and poverty, in cases where perhaps even the most pious individual can still be submitted to these things. And I think that it is not the case that the disease and poverty are altogether divine judgment. There are instances in which we have to recognize our existence. I hesitate to say reality because it's not quite reality. There is a fundamental distinction. There are two sets of laws by which we follow. There is our natural law, and there is our divine law. And our divine law has to do with mind. The mind exists within the natural frame. And I think this often can be misleading to us in the modern day, because we tend to see that all that there is just the emergent qualities, the things of nature, the things that are bound to natural law. And the more refined things, the more refined types of judgment that we can observe, I think, objectively, empirically. These things tend to operate on slightly different laws. And I think it's within these portions of our reality. It's interesting. both of which wouldn't even be possible to conceptualize if it weren't for the human mind. They would still exist, no doubt. But what would it mean of the reality and the life that operates by these laws? You know, there would be animals that go about their day. They get a tumor here. They get eaten by an animal there. Where's the judgment? Is it the judgment of nature? The judgment of God? Exactly what is this reality? What is it about the lower forms of being that seems so different from our own? That seem just so much closer to the natural law rather than the divine law? And why is it that we human beings are the only ones that we are aware of that busy ourselves with the philosophy of mind? And so to get back to Socrates, when he says, I think that many people who fear disease and poverty and many other such things feel fear, but are not ashamed of the things they fear. I think I would be not necessarily satisfied, but I would allow a bookmark to be placed there for the possibility that there is this natural law and divine law distinction. But where there is shame, there is also fear. As Socrates says, it seems like they are close companions. For is there anyone who, in feeling shame and embarrassment at anything, does not also at the same time fear and dread a reputation for wickedness? Now this form of reasoning is similar to that of the poet that he put forth. This is more the divine law. Whereas before we had the natural law, now we have the divine law. Because the person, although it's sort of seeped in a very self-centered frame, that being that the person who is feeling shame and embarrassment has these emotions because they fear and dread a reputation for wickedness. Now they fear it from man. I think the pious fears it from the gods. And I think it can be just to fear it from the gods if what they fear is just in the absolute sense of just. The absolute sense of what is right. And the pious individual is committed to understanding what is right. Ideally, the gods would be the arbiters of truth and of what is right. But what is right seems to be such a slippery topic, as we have seen throughout this dialogue, that it's hard to make heads or tails of this divine nature. Euthyphro says, he, referring to the man that is feeling the shame and embarrassment, that he would be afraid of this reputation for wickedness. It is then not right to say, where there is fear, there is also shame, but that where there is shame, there is also fear, for fear covers a larger area than shame. Shame is a part of fear, just as odd is a part of number, with the result that it is not true that where there is number, there is also oddness, but that where there is oddness, there is also number. And I think on the surface it sounds as though he is right, because he's recognizing that this fear can be attributed to natural law or divine law, essentially. At least this is how it appears to me. Because we are all afraid of some judgment, whether it be a disinterested one or one that has some directed purpose to it. And he says this fear, this sort of emotion of the heart being the seat of feelings, we can say that the heart covers a larger area than shame. And shame is the sense of guilt of a wrong that has been committed. And I think this is right, because the heart is something that is by itself multiplicitous. It is a thing that pulls, it drags us away, it excites us. It's indifferent to our reason. And shame is much more subtle. It is of mind, it is of soul. And this shame and this guilt, it has to come from an understanding of being. For one has to understand what is in order to feel guilt over moving away from what is, moving away from the truth that they actually believe in. Now, it doesn't mean that this truth that they believe in is right, but it does mean that they can at least experience the sensation of shame. Now, I think I would like to think that the upright man, the righteous man, is the man that leads by his shame, that leads by his shame before his fear, regardless of the area involved. Now, it's a strange thing to say, lead by shame, but it's meant to illustrate a larger point, that we should lead by this subtlety, because the filter through which water flows is often smaller in terms of area than the water that flows through it. And it must be this way. We cannot have a filter that encompasses the surface area of all possible surfaces that the water can move to. It's just not practical to do it this way. We have to direct it to a certain point. And as this water is directed through tubes and pipes and all this sort of thing to a certain point, then it can be filtered correctly. It's concentrated. And I think in this way, the shame operates with fear. And this really is a matter of nature, or rather of heaven and of earth. He says, shame is a part of fear, just as odd is a part of number, with the result that it is not true that where there is number, there is also oddness. Because number has a larger surface area, just like fear has a larger surface area than shame. But that where there is oddness, there is also number. Now the problem with this analogy, although it makes sense, is that it is a disinterested analogy. Shame and fear are much more elevated than number. That's not to say that number does not have value. It has value. It's just lesser, I think, on the scale of this hierarchy. Now let's take a moment and reflect on the Christian perspective and bringing it into Plato's world. In the Christian perspective, you have the creative source, the purposeful source, the meaningful source, as the thing that has the absolute largest surface area. And the smaller surface area is not really a smaller surface area. I suppose we can think about it this way. But it is something that exists at once within it, but entirely separate from it. Almost as if we were to create a work of art. In some sense, that work of art is us. It is a reflection of our creativity. But now the art is apart from us. It has gone from our mind into a different sphere. It has gone into the world, let's say. Now we could say it has gone from the world of the imaginative to the world of the concrete. But I don't think this is quite right. Because the imaginative was the thing that gave birth to it. What we say in this day and age is that the subjective does not have much value. And the objective is the thing that brings us truth. But without the subject, without the meaningful, directed, purposeful approach to life, how can we do anything? How can we produce anything? We would be nothing more than animals. Even animals aren't that low. We would be a state of being that is... I'm not sure if being can even exist in that state. It'd be like a rock. It'd be pure earth. This is the kind of thing I was asked before. Whether where there is piety, there is also justice. But where there is justice, there is not also piety. For the pious is a part of justice. Shall we say that? Or do you think otherwise? And Euthyphro says, no, but like that, for what you say appears to be right. And so it seems that we have come to the conclusion in parallel with Socrates. The conclusion being that where there is justice, there is not always piety, but the pious is a part of justice. Because the pious is a devotion. Justice is what is right. Justice is. Now we can imagine many pious men. But not all men. I would say that it would be impossible almost to say that any one man is just, but rather more just than another. for us to be entirely just would be to be elevated beyond our state of being, beyond our given state of being. And I think the interesting thing about man is that we are capable of transcending and transforming into new, enlightened states of thought. Now, certainly, probably, there are limits to this enlightenment, perhaps by natural constraints, just as there are limits to the behaviors of animals. We can domesticate our animals to make them seemingly more just. We can raise them in a way that makes them more congruent to interaction with humanity. I think specifically of dogs and of cats. You can have a domesticated animal, like a dog or a cat, and raise it to be a horrible thing, a thing that sort of values violence, it values conflict, let's say, or domination, power. And of course, value in this sense is a bit off, because it's not an enlightened sense of value. But I think there is, just as we are talking here about parts of a whole, I think the experience that the animal, the domesticated animal, can have of these elevated things can be said to be something approaching virtue and of value, because it contains the elements and pieces of it. And again, I refer back to the example of the different ways that an animal can turn out based on how it is raised, based on the inputs that it is given, the type of socialization, the love that it receives. The dogs in particular, they can display very human emotions. And I think they run through similar processes that we do. Although, again, it is to a lesser degree than man. Man seems to be the outlier. But perhaps only an outlier because of the degree of the proportion of the just that he is able to conceptualize relative to the other animals and other beings within his observable experience. And I should also mention that the very same processes that occur in the dog, the socialization process from birth to maturity, the process that can be white or black in the sense of experience and of mind, I think and also can apply to man. I mean, there are no shortage of people that have had terrible upbringings, that have had difficulty later in life managing and regulating their emotions. There have been plenty of people who have transformed because of it. There have been plenty of people that have transformed after their terrible upbringing later in life, that have come to know certain things about themselves, certain things about the world, that just sort of changes their perspective and they transform. And I think the same is, it's harder for animals, but I think it's similar for dogs. Dogs that have been beaten, I think can turn around. Now the degree to which the light can shine in, I think, is limited in these types of beings, but I think it still exists in many animals that roam the earth today. Now, that's not to say that they are the same as human beings. They are not. But to return to this dialogue, and to return to this conversation about the parts of the whole, the pious, the religious devotion being a part of the whole of justice, which is our right and wrong. This is our truth. This is the what is, in a sense. And so, in my mind, when I hear Socrates talking about number, and when he says, see what comes next, if the pious is a part of the just, we must, it seems, find out what part of the just it is. Now, if you asked me something of what we mentioned just now, such as what part of number is the even, and what number that is, I would say it is the number that is divisible into two equal, not unequal parts. Or do you not think so? And Euthyphro says, I do. And he continues and he says, try in this way to tell me what part of the just is pious, in order to tell Meletus not to wrong us any more, and not to indict me for ungodliness, since I have learned from you sufficiently what is godly and pious and what is not. So here we have a new challenge by Socrates. And again, I refer to the analogy used prior in this podcast, the unfolding of the flower. This is an opportunity. We are given something to imagine. We are given number, which implies mathematics. It implies all the available numbers within our numeric system. And it's interesting when he says when he asks the question, what part of the just is the pious? He indicates an answer of number. He says, well, what part of number is the even? It is not 2, it is not 4, it is not 6. These are even numbers, but it is not the principle by which we can define what is even. What is even is divisible into two equal parts. And I think part of the reason why you can't answer the question sufficiently, what part of number, or even what number of number is even or odd, is it because there is an infinite number of even numbers. There's an infinite number of odd numbers. And so, in order to deal with the infinite, we have to have superior or supraordinate principles. And so if we imagine in our mind a landscape, a particular area of our reality that is encompassed by what is just, again, the differentiation between the right and the wrong, and then the supraordinating principle, which would be the truth, and everything that flows from the truth, or that unification, then allows us to identify which is true and which is false. Just like in the case of, we can identify different numbers, and we can ask ourselves, well, is this even and is this odd? Well, it's difficult to start there if you don't know what even is and you don't know what odd is, because you have to have some unifying principle before you even begin the process of answering the question. And so just like the even and the odd in number, the unifying principle being the divisible by 2, or in the case of the even, the divisible into two equal parts, I think just, at the very least, is the truth, and that anything that is in line with the truth is just. Anything that is not in line with the truth is unjust. But the problem lies with the truth. And I think just like number, the truth is infinite. And so if we ask ourselves, well, what is number? What is truth? We have to have a similar conception in our minds that these concepts are infinite. It doesn't mean that we can't operate within the space of number. It does not mean that we cannot operate within the space of truth. But it does mean that for our part, perhaps just like an animal with a limited capacity to have the light shine in for a transformative experience so that they can change their behavior, that they can return to a more sophisticated state of domestication after living a life of violence and of perhaps fighting other animals for sport. We remain in this way limited. Now, Euthyphro's response to Socrates is this. I think, Socrates, that the godly and pious is the part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods, while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice. And I think this is a good conception, because here we have the recognition of these levels, of these supraordinate principles, and in this case it's the supraordinate forms of conscious beings. That is the God, or godly and pious, is a part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods. Or, in other words, is the part of the just that is concerned with the care of elevated beings. Now, I'm not sure if that is completely sufficient, because, well, maybe it's sufficient to answer the questions of parts of the whole, but not necessarily the whole itself. But setting that aside, continuing, saying that while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice, so that which is beyond human conception, that part of the infinite that is beyond the human mind, at least for now, right, barring the capacity for human enlightenment, the remaining things that humanity can see is the sort of remaining part of justice. And however we get there, whether it's through our reason or through our experiences and our see, this is a difficult thing, because truth is not just reason, it is not just our experiences. Now, it is altogether bound up in something that is real, and something that is true. Now, we can believe in something that is not true, but it involves something that is more than just reason. Because there are inputs that go into the flow that is reason, that makes it reasonable. And I think within these inputs, whether it be inputs from the environment, sort of the inputs that we have evolved for our existence within this environment, our various sense organs, allows us to perceive, smell, taste, see, hear, feel, all this sort of thing. All of these inputs come into us and form this picture, this image, this illustration of the natural world of reality. And we are able, almost like Lincoln Logs or like Legos, place pieces higher and higher and higher. The individual pieces themselves don't mean much to us. But when we integrate them into a whole, we begin to understand more and more. It becomes increasingly intelligible. So again, Euthyphro's statement, I think, Socrates, that the godly and pious is part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods, while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice. And now what Socrates finds interesting about this statement is Euthyphro's use of the word care. So before we get into exactly what Socrates, the road that Socrates would like to walk down in terms of the correct usage of care in this scenario, I think it's useful to try and unpack this before it happens and see if we find ourselves in parallel with the thinking later on down the line. So as we've already talked about, we've been talking about the piece of the whole, that justice is the whole, that the piety, this religious devotion lies within it. Because there has to be something of this whole, sort of this telescope through which we view and we see the just, and our piety is sort of our interaction, this sort of transjective that leads us to be able to properly interpret the reality that is. And I should say that everything that is below the infinite would only be able to perceive a part of it. Now this gets into the discussion that we were having earlier about our senses and about the information that we build up into some sort of image that is intelligible to us. Now, we can get lost in our bias exploration. That is, we can delude ourselves into thinking that what we are doing is right when it is in fact wrong. But it's interesting, Euthyphro says that the godly and pious is part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods. So care in this sense, it seems to imply or is approaching something Unitarian. Now this is not something that is surprising given the conversation that we have been having, because justice is a source of sorts. That meaning that it is something that we draw from. And if the godly and the pious is something that is drawn from this source, and these things are concerned with the care of the gods, then I think we see the lineage of this sort of descending, what would we say? It could be a descending light, a descending intelligibility. It is an aspect of reality as it comes down. The question is, well, why would it come down at all? Why would something of a higher place willingly create something that descends away from it? Now this might not be the best way of thinking about it, is because things that are created, especially things of a sophisticated sort that have the capacity to choose which way they go, is not necessarily a reflection of the source. Their mechanism, their being, is a reflection of the source, but perhaps not their action. And this descending, we may also interpret this as a sort of a flowing from a being that creates something else. and this something else necessarily flows from it. And it's not necessarily that it's lesser, although that is a quality of it. And so this godly and pious thing, this descending thing, is concerned with the care of the gods, while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice. So it's an interesting statement, but it's not something that is complete, and I think Socrates sees this, because I think what we run into here is a problem of the cutting up of this whole, and this whole being justice. The justice being what is right and what is wrong, and in a sense, well, what is the good? And so again, I think this problem is Euthyphro's splitting up of the whole. I think the general mechanism of the whole contributing to its parts is an element of it. But to say that the godliness and the pious is concerned with the care of the gods and the remainder of justice is concerned with men, I'm not quite sure that makes much sense. Because certainly there is piousness that is concerned with the care of men. Otherwise we would not have pious men. And so Socrates says, you seem to me to put that very well, but I still need a bit of information. I do not know yet what you mean by care, for you do not mean care of the gods in the same sense as the care of other things. As, for example, we say, don't we, that not everyone knows how to care for horses, but the horse breeder does. Now, I think it's worth mentioning here before I move on that I understand that I'm coming from a place that might not exactly seem or exactly fit with what is being spoken of here. Because there is a way to see this that is, piousness and godliness that comes from something that then embodies the lower form that embodies the gods, and in this sense, these things provide the care of the gods, but I believe it's a reciprocal relationship. That is, the gods concern themselves with the care of the piousness, so what is above them, while what is above them concerns what is below them with the care that is itself, that is the highest form of good. So it's this two-way street, and I recognize that when I was explaining this, that this might not have directly seemed to be something that was stated in the text. But now we're getting into we're continuing this conversation. Socrates says, and he gives a number of different examples about what exactly care might mean. And he gives the example of the horse breeder knowing how to care for horses, and while others may not necessarily know how to care for horses. And the reason here that the horse breeder is the one that can care for horses is because they have the knowledge and the understanding of the horse. They know what it needs. Now, I think that there is a bit of a problem within the care of these horses, because it denies, or rather it does not assume, the fundamental care, the purpose of breeding horses. Now, one can breed horses insofar as to maintain them, care for them, and provide food for them, make sure that they are healthy. but also do it only so that they can sell the horses in the future, and not necessarily for the sake of the horses. And so I think that this is one possible distinction that I would like to leave here as we move on. Socrates gives another example. Nor does everyone know how to care for dogs, but the hunter does. And so he says, so hunting is the care of dogs. Cattle raising is the care of cattle. While piety and godliness is the care of the gods. Euthyphro. And he asks, is that what you mean? And Euthyphro replies, it is. And so here we fall back on my initial interpretation. Cattle raising is the care of cattle. That godliness and piety is the care of the gods. And so Socrates says, now care in each case has the same effect. It aims at the good and the benefit of the object cared for. As you can see that the horses cared for by the horse breeders are benefited and become better. Or do you not agree? And Socrates continues, he says, so dogs are benefited by dog breeding, cattle by cattle raising, and so with all the others. Or do you think that the care aims to harm the object of its care? And Euthyphro says, by Zeus, no. So it must aim to benefit the object of its care. And Euthyphro says, of course. Is piety then, which is the care of the gods, also to benefit the gods and make them better? Would you agree that when you do something pious, you make someone of the gods better? And Euthyphro says no, and Socrates says, nor do I think that this is what you mean. Now, from our earlier interpretation, this is exactly what I meant. That the interaction of the gods with piety and with godliness makes them better. Now, I think this probably would be a blasphemous thing to say in their era. And I think that that is because of the understanding that the gods are not absolute in their current form. But the interesting thing is, as we continue the conversation, Euthyphro says that this kind of care is the kind of care that slaves take of their masters. Now, the language that is used here is a bit confusing, because we have this new conception. We have a denial that the piousness and the godliness is not the thing that makes them better. So by care, in some sense, it is not to make them better, but it aims to benefit the object of its care, which doesn't seem to make much sense here. And so we have this new conception that the relationship or type of care is wound up in a relationship that is similar to the slaves that take of their masters. And so Socrates says this is a kind of service of the gods. And so Socrates goes through a few different examples. Of what goal service to doctors tend? The achievement of what goal service to doctors tend? Is it not, do you think, to achieving health? Euthyphro says, I think so. What about service to shipbuilders? To what achievement is it directed? Clearly, to the building of a ship. and service to house builders to the building of a house. I'm not quite sure the usage of the word service here, but we will continue. And so Socrates then wants to know, to the achievement of what aim does service to the gods tend? And Euthyphro says, many fine things. And so then we're trying to figure out, okay, what are these many fine things? Euthyphro says, I told you a short while ago, Socrates, that it is a considerable task to acquire any precise knowledge of these things. But, to put it simply, I say that if a man knows how to say and do what is pleasing to the gods, that prayer and sacrifice, those are pious actions, such as preserve both private houses and public affairs of state. The opposite of these actions are impious and overturn and destroy everything. So again, this really has nothing to do with the nature of piousness, but it has to do with the observation of the effects of piety in the world, and that the correct pious action, when it is performed, it sort of preserves human society. It keeps the state intact. It keeps the private housing or private life intact, whether that be the family or the community or what have you. And then the impious is the thing that destroys all of it, overturns and destroys everything. And so we still really don't know what piousness is, though we can infer based on the consequences of our actions. And so we can sort of come to an incomplete picture of it. And so of Euthyphro's knowledge of piety, we come to Socrates asking the question, are they a knowledge of how to sacrifice and pray? Euthyphro says they are. To sacrifice is to make a gift to the gods, whereas to pray is to beg from the gods. And to this Euthyphro agrees. Piety, then, would be a knowledge of how to give to and beg from the gods. And Euthyphro continues to agree. And now he says, what is this service to the gods? You say it is to beg from them and to give to them. And to beg correctly would be to ask from them things that we need. And to give correctly is to give them what they need from us. For it would not be skillful to bring gifts to anyone that are in no way needed. And Euthyphro agrees. And then Socrates comes to this conclusion based on that reason, that piety is then a sort of trading skill between the gods and men. And Euthyphro says, okay, if you want to put it that way, yeah, sure, go ahead. And so now the line of questioning is, okay, so we have this relationship. If piousness is a relationship. Now what's interesting here, the thought just crossed my mind, we started with justice, and piety being a part of justice. That then flows down to the concern of the gods. But then we rejected the idea that, in their words, would you agree that when you do something pious, you make some one of the gods better? Or when he says, is piety then, which is the care of the gods, also to benefit the gods and make them better? And then Euthyphro says, no. And Socrates says, no, I didn't think that you were thinking that way. But if he was to think that way, and the gods had this relationship with something above them, then it would just sort of logically flow that our relationship to the gods is what we receive from them is their devotion to the one or the form of justice. And what we give to them is, it's a strange thing to say give, because we can say what we give them is reverence. We sacrifice to them. And I think part of the problem here is that the relationship becomes a relationship, at least the perception here, when Socrates says piety would then be a sort of trading skill between gods and men. It's more of a business relationship. It's not one of love. It's not like that of a good friend or of a close family member that wishes to see us well. And that what one wants one to see for the one that they truly love is that they are safe, they are secure, and they are satisfied in their endeavors. And all of these are bound together by some form of good. And if they are overly burdened, perhaps by an occupation or oversaddled with debt or something, that then this would not be something that we would look kindly on, because the individual that is going through this is suffering. Their being is not harmonious. It's not loving. It's in a constant state of tension. It is constantly trying to overcome itself just to maintain its existence. The self does not blend well with the reality that it finds itself in. And if the self does not blend well to the reality that it finds itself in, I think it's not really a pious action. And in that way, in this disruption of piety on the part of man and in the relationship to the Greek gods, it disrupts their relationship, their harmonious relationship. Now, it is unlike what Socrates says here, that it is sort of a trading skill relationship between gods and men. It is a relationship of love, and the relationship of love, when it is in communion, when there is continual flow between the levels of consciousness, there is a continuity, just as sort of the continuity on a highway, the flow on a highway. If the volume is too high, the continuity decreases. The cars become congested. Or if there's an accident, then there's like a true blockage of the highway. And you don't get this flow of meaningful, everything is within its place. The road is operating to serve as a facilitator by which we can drive to our destinations. If the road of intelligibility is complicated, then it no longer fulfills its purpose. The being then that exists upon that highway, that substrate, is congested. It creates tension. The heart, being the seat of all feelings and desires, becomes frustrated. It becomes torn and placed in a state of despair. And it has this sort of forever longing of a return to a state of flow. And so this central point that is very difficult for me to answer, that Socrates raises, well, what is the benefit that the gods get from us? We get from them piousness and all this sort of thing. Well, we can make an argument in the Greek case, because what do we truly get from the gods if they are only these self-interested, self-glorifying beings? Certainly in that case, their piety would come into question, because they are not serving what's higher. And if they don't serve what's higher, then what comes down to us is not higher, we can say. But then the question is, well, how do we know? How do we know that they are not doing as what needs to be done so that man can live in a harmonious existence? And I sort of return to Euthyphro's empirical approach here, because I'm not really entirely sure I know the answer. It's events and things that have happened throughout our history that we can understand. They sort of operate at a scale well above the human action, or well above the individual, let's say. And it's a form of its own, a being of its own, if you would like. But to return to this dialogue, we ask the question, how are the gods benefit? How do they benefit by what they receive from us? Or do we have such an advantage over them in the trade that we receive all our blessings from them and they receive nothing from us? And eventually they get to a point where Euthyphro says, well, no, what they receive from us, this piousness that is pleasing to the gods, it is most pleasing to them and dear to them. And so then we return to the pious once again being what is dear to the gods. And Euthyphro says, most certainly. And I believe that where they went wrong was not dealing more fully with the unification, with dealing with justice as a whole and a form itself that piousness comes from. And this piousness is just like the highway. It taps into the beings, the celestial beings that are well above man, the polytheistic gods in the Greek society. That taps into them, that makes them better, because they can conceive of something greater than themselves. They can conceive of the infinite. Even if they are infinite beings in and of themselves, they are separate from one another. And so once they realize that there is actually a unification of all of this into one thing, then this flows down through them to us. But otherwise, we keep going around this sort of wheel of subjectivity, because the gods have different desires. They are just as fallen as man is, perhaps not to the same degree, and they represent a different level of intelligence, a different level of intelligibility, but still, nonetheless, they are fallen beneath the source of it all. And so no wonder Socrates is being indicted for corrupting the city youth and creating new gods. This line of thinking leads you to think of something beyond the city gods that are the sort of current cultural conception. But it's also very dangerous, because this is the thing that binds everybody together. All their stories, their customs, their beliefs are wound up in these narratives about these gods. And it's not the case that their narratives and things are wrong. There may be some wrong things in them. Who knows? That's not really the point. The point is that the conception of reality is not zoomed out far enough. There's a larger picture to be seen. And so Socrates challenges Euthyphro again. One last challenge. He says, look, you're indicting your father. You surely must know to take this step. And Euthyphro says some other time, Socrates, for I am in a hurry now, and it is time for me to go. And Socrates concludes by saying, what a thing to do, my friend. By going you have cast me down from a great hope I had, that I would learn from you the nature of the pious and the impious, and so escape Meletus. Meletus's indictment by showing him that I have acquired wisdom in divine matters from Euthyphro, and my ignorance would no longer cause me to be careless and inventive about such things, and that I would be better for the rest of my life. And so this is just the beginning, I think. This dialogue is just the beginning. And we begin next time with the apology. And the apology is Socrates' defense. And so it's a very interesting beginning. A very interesting entry point into the Platonic dialogues. Because we can see a problem here that is quite large. It has societal implications. But this is where we will leave it, and we will begin next time with the apology.